Welcome, everyone, to the Art of Game Mastery's Finding Path stream. This is episode 23, and today we're going to be talking about sandboxes. This was actually Jackie put out a poll on Twitter, I believe, right? Where you asked people what they wanted to see next.
I did put out a poll. This was the next top voted.
Yeah, so I think this is one we've actually been wanting to do for a while anyway, because both you and I have, I don't want to say very differing, but a lot of opinions on the topic, some of which differ, some of which are the same. I know, Jackie, you almost exclusively run Sandbox games. I have run them in the past, and I'm currently kind of running one with the West Marches game that's going on. So we've each learned various things along our times running these kinds of games. So I guess before we get into the meat and potatoes of this episode, I want to ask you, Jackie, to you, what is a sandbox game in your opinion?
So I made a shout out on Reddit to see what everybody liked about sandboxes, and the question is completely opposite to what everybody answered, because everybody wanted to get into how I phrased the question, and they brought up a lot of good points, and I'm kind of glad that we had several discussions about that. A sandbox, to me, and what we'll be talking about, is where there is no there's no direct plot. It's entirely up to the players to decide where they're going to go. So it's giving the players the freedom to decide what's going to happen, and it's complete opposite from a module. There are modules that are very sandbox-like, but sandboxes usually have a specific goal to complete the campaign, and so a sandbox does not have that goal in mind. It's kind of up to the players to choose what quests they're going to go on. They're going to pick what sounds interesting to them. They're going to kind of make the game how they want it.
Yeah, and I think I think a lot of people watching this video, either now or in the future, have probably already seen Matt Colville's Running the Game video on Sandbox. And Matt Colville and I both come from a video game development background, and he brought up a good point in his video that in the video game industry, we kind of differentiate the term sandbox from the term open world. To video game designers, a sandbox more has to do with the environment, like being able to use. You were basically given an environment with various tools and toys to play with, and any of those things can be used to solve any of the problems you present. It doesn't really have anything to do with plot lines or anything. You can have a sandbox game that's linear. You can have a sandbox game that's open world. I think, but in the context of tabletop RPGs, I think when people say sandbox, they mean exactly what you say, where it's in the video game parlance, it'd be open world, basically, where you can kind of go anywhere, accept whatever quests you want, do whatever you want to do. There may or may not be a main plot line, but it's completely up to the players whether they choose to partake it, or if they do, when they choose to partake it. A good example of a modern sandbox game might be Skyrim, where you have a main plot line, but if you're anything like me, you've played the game on literally every platform it's ever been created on and never once completed the main plot line, but spent hundreds and hundreds of hours just doing side quests and exploring the world and doing whatever I felt like at the time. So I think you're right that in the context of tabletop RPGs, that's what we mean when we say sandbox. Now,
some notable sandboxes that I think that we can agree on, but you're kind of the lead expert when it comes to video game design. Would you say that BioShock would be a sandbox kind of game?
So I actually haven't really played the BioShock franchise. That's typically It's not really my style of game. But I've heard good things about it, and from what I understand about it, though, it isn't a full-on sandbox game, but it does have a lot of sandbox elements to it. But I'd have to sit down and really play the franchise to really make a definitive statement on that.
Have you played the Arkham Asylum games?
The Batman games? No, I haven't.
No?
So I typically play more Western and Japanese RPGs. So things like Skyrim, things like Fallout, things like the original Fallouts. I'm not super keen on the more modern takes of Fallout. I feel like they've lost a lot of the magic That
So, do you feel that Fallout is a sandbox
yes,
as
very much
opposed
so.
to?
Yeah, you have a lot
So,
of
what
like
would be an
things.
example?
And
What would you say the
you're
example
talking
is
in
of
video
the
game
open world?
parlance, right? Not tabletop RPG. Like you're talking about like how we in video games talk about
Right.
sandbox, right? Okay.
Because there's a lot of overlap between video games and tabletop
Yeah.
RPGs, and so sometimes it's good to have like some solid, comparisons or metaphors or definitions to kind of help. So, like,
Yeah.
what do you
So
consider an open world?
open world are games like the Elder Scrolls games, like Morrowind or Skyrim, or even like the earlier ones, like Daggerfall is like the epitome of open world, in my opinion, where it's actually a lot of this stuff is randomly generated. In fact, almost all of that game is randomly generated, and it really lets you kind of do whatever the heck it is you want to do, and that's kind of one way of looking at sandbox, and it's actually the way we're more concerned with in this video, because I think any tabletop RPG fits the criteria for sandbox that we use in video games, right? Like if you're playing in it with a good GM and a good group of players, you're going to have all kinds of tools at your disposal. You're going to be able to think creatively and, critically about what you can do to solve various problems. And as a GM, you're often not going to expect what the players come up with, right? Like that's one of the beauties of like a tabletop RPG is you're not confined to the limitations that you would in a typical video game that sandbox games try to solve. In a tabletop RPG, your imagination is the limit, right? So you you naturally have that sandboxy nature to your games, or at least you should. If you're not, you're probably not
Has a
having
lot
a
of
good time.
grit.
Yeah. But
Sorry for
what
the
we
pun.
don't often have in tabletop RPGs, and like you said, in modules, this is especially the case because it's really hard to build a cohesive module that works for everyone if you take a more open world approach. But when you talk about sandbox and tabletop RPGs, I think that we mean exactly what you describe in what video games we call open world, where you have a bunch of various plot lines and you have, these may or may not be main plot lines. They could just be random side quests. They could be what you call hunts in your Tagasia, right? Where you're really bounties, basically, right? You're just after a particular monster or trying to find a particular treasure hoard or something, right? And I think all of these are very important to have in your tabletop RPG session, even if you're not running a full-on sandbox style game. But as I'm about to get into, prepping for sandboxes can be very daunting. And I know when you prepared for Tagasia, you spent countless hours before we even started playing on building that out. So how do you go about, as someone who basically almost entirely runs sandbox style games as a GM, how do you go about preparing for them?
All right, so I've run long-standing Tagasia. Libra was about a year. Tagasia is over 2 years now, and my previous game, back when I was before we met, was about 2 years running. It was also a sandbox game, and before that, I had worked on a literal desert themed sandbox. So I've done about 4 different sandboxes, and I've kind of all approached them roughly the similar way, and I've just kind of refined the tools and on my trade as I practice these kind of things. And the first thing I start off with is the lesser hub and the greater hub. That has been like my go-to thesis for how to do a good sandbox. I strongly recommend the players start off in a small backwater town that doesn't have access to everything. That motivates the players to leave that starting place, because from what I've learned is that players like to stay in the town that you start them off in, and they will never leave.
So just to clarify for people new, to GMing in the game, what do you mean when you say hub in this case?
So if you take a crack open the core rulebook or the player's hand guide to any Pathfinder or Dungeons & Dragons game, or even Starfinder, and you look at what you can spend the credits on, there's gear, and there's tables for loot, and there's things that you can buy. And so a hub really strongly just kind of recommend is that what are the things the players are spending their rewards on. And so a hub to me is, do they have crafting stations? So is there a blacksmith in the town? Is there a synthesizer? Is there a mage's guild? So they have access to doing some of the more complex stuff, whether they're enchanting their gear or putting runes on their gear, right?
So it's
So you
it's
start off with
basically
that.
it's basically a town or a settlement where they have access to do various things, and they. So when I think of hub, I think of it's a place that people keep coming back to, right? It's a home
Right.
base basically where you have all these like you said, crafting stations and um, shops and maybe even a couple important NPCs
Right.
where players can. It's a place to return to for safety, right? Um,
Hmm.
and as you kind of allude to, you can have multiple of these. Like you might have one big hub, or you might have your hub might change over time, or you might have mini hubs that you go back and forth between. It's kind of how you want to run it. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. I just wanted to clarify that for people who
I
weren't
think that
familiar.
it's really good clarification. Not everybody is going to be familiar with the lingo. So my hubs, where I recommended the place that you return to, headquarters, HQ, the secret base. I really strongly recommend having a tiny settlement. I think I stole this from Morrowind first originally when you land in what's it called, Nasadine.
I don't remember the
You end
town,
up
but
in a starting
it's
settlement and it has
it's
the bare minimum.
backwaters, literally.
It is literally a backwater, and you start off with the bare minimum, and that's perfect for players because you'll see when some players start. I've watched a lot of people play Morrowind first starting out back in the day when we couldn't really share controllers for like Morrowind, so I would show my friends Morrowind, and some people would stay in that first town, and that was the highlight of the game. They didn't want to leave that beginning town. They would do every single quest in that area. They would buy and sell all of the best possible gear they could get, and other people would go, "Where's the big city?" And they would go straight to like Balmora, or they would go straight to the next settlement because they didn't want to be in that little tiny town.
Yeah,
And so that was where I got the first idea to kind of start your players off in a place that promotes them to leave where they are. You don't, me personally, when I'm running a sandbox, I don't want my players to be stuck in a rut. I don't want them to feel like they can't leave the town. I want them to feel like they can move, that they can go explore. Because I mean, even you've seen in the loading screens, half the time it says just pick a direction and you'll go find something,
yeah,
and that's how a sandbox should be operated.
yeah. I mean, you mentioned a good point about the towns in that um different towns okay, so in Pathfinder 2e in the game mastery guide they have a section in there around building settlements, and we've actually done an entire stream on this in the past around how we build settlements, and we actually, I think both of us end up using those rules to some extent. And it recommends giving your settlements levels, and this kind of determines things like what kind of monsters are found around it or within it, right? If it's an urban sprawl, what kind of what level of items you can find in it, what range of items, etc. And this might also determine how strong the NPCs in that town are, right? Like if you have a lot of murder hobos, the town guard of a high level town are probably pretty high level themselves. They're probably like some holy knight order or something. I don't know, however you want to homebrew that. But I think this is a really good approach to this because it gives a sense of realism to the area, and like a backwaters town probably isn't going to have access to as much resources as a large city is going to have. So naturally they're going to be, they're not going to have as many things for sale. You're probably not going to find any or very little magic items in a low level town. Things like
Right.
that. So I think that that's a really good, like you said, starting in a low level town for low level adventures. And I also want to point out that you don't need to have a progression in your town. Like you could have a level 1 town that is like relatively close to like a level 10 city, right? If they go that direction, they're probably going to encounter things that are a little, above their weight class. But hopefully they realize that early and move on somewhere else. So like in a real sandbox game, there's not necessarily a strict progression and level. Like even if you're a level 1 character, you might not always find yourself encountering level 1 enemies or NPCs or shops or things like that. Now on the flip side of that,
the exact point I feel about sandboxes.
there's a flip side of that though, in that if you're using your city level to determine what shops you have access to, then they could eventually make their way to a much higher level city by sheer luck or cleverness, and they could have access to those higher level items if they have the gold, right? Generally, those higher level items are very expensive, and they probably don't have the gold to buy them anyway. But
There's always that one player who's hoarding all their
yeah,
gold.
so you kind of have to prepare for that as a GM and think, okay, what am I going to do if they by some miracle they make it here and happen to have the amount of gold to buy this kind of thing? And maybe you just let it go. Maybe you just say that's the magic of this game, and if they get it, they get it, you know. But
So P. Razzo was talking about level appropriate challenges, and that was literally like the part I wanted to mention. Kind of like turn back the stage, right? Because as a GM, you're kind of on a stage, and to see like where we're pulling the strings from behind these things. So I recommend the small hub to the large hub as a method for your players. And here's why I recommend it for GMs. So there's the other side to the show, is that it's going to get you ready to start developing level-based challenges, because now you're already thinking about how cities interact with each other. This is going to help bring your world to life for you. It's going to be easier for you to reference. So designing that small little town and then thinking about what does that small little town do? You might design the big town first and then the little town, whichever comes easier for you, but you're going to start thinking about imports and exports. What function does this town have? Is it just the town got too big and some people moved away, or does it serve a key function? And sometimes having a key function can be really useful. It can be a port, or it can have a mine. It can have, some tactical advantage. And we're talking about designing a sandbox. You need to be thinking about, like, did this city just appear out of nowhere for no reason? You kind of want to, like, for your verisimilitude, you want to have a reason or a rhyme for these towns that you're putting together.
And these town levels and sizes aren't static, right? In a good sandbox game, they're going to grow or shrink over time based on external or internal factors, right? Mm-hmm. Like there might be a rebellion in one of the. There might be a rebellion.
You got to decide that as a GM.
Was that
like when you're deciding? You got to decide that as a GM if you want yours to be dynamic or static. I wanted my my towns to be static, to have set levels from ranges from like. I wanted that beginning town to be level 1 to 2, and I wanted the next towns nearby to be 3 to 4. I wanted that further away town to be 5 to 8 level. And then the party stayed in those spots, and I had to adapt as a GM and go, okay, well, this is what I initially set out for, but it is a sandbox. So as far as like prepping goes, you in your head might think that you're going to scale the adventure as needed, and your party members are going to go the opposite direction, You're like, yeah, none of those quest hooks were interesting, and they're going to go the opposite direction. And so everything you plan for, or the other way around, your players are going to, stay in that area, and you're going to want to have a dynamic, you're going to want to have a static town, and your players are going to stay there, and you're going to have to start scaling. Otherwise, they're going to get bored if they're just rolling over all of the...
P. Razzo says, static town size, not if it burns to the ground. That's true.
Okay. I
mean, exactly technically, yeah, that's dynamic, right?
Burning to the ground is totally dynamic.
So you mentioned a little bit about planning, as a game master and determining all this stuff. So what goes into planning for you? Like what, you mentioned all these like things you consider, but how do you actually go about, like, do you plan everything up front? How do you do that?
I'm super old school. I take pen and paper before the days of Roll20, and I draw little circles to kind of represent where my hubs are. And then I kind of like gesticulate some distances to kind of figure out like where the next quests are going to be. And with a small hub, I try to limit how many. That's not what dynamic lighting means. Okay, Razzo. So I start off with the different points, and I try not to bombard them with too many quest hooks. So the small hub is going to have 1 or 2 like hunts. So that's real simple. Those are does the party dynamic function, or is it fluid, right? Mm-hmm. You show up to a sandbox game and you have all DPS, and not a single person can tank, not a single person can heal, and those level 1 little like elite monsters for the party to face is a great DPS test to say like, hey, maybe somebody needs to re-roll. Mm-hmm. That happens quite often in groups. And so I really recommend having, I plan a couple of little hunts. I plan a couple of little tiny quests, usually something real easy, a retrieval of an item, a little nuisance guy who stole something, like a thief, bandits nearby, easy stuff, right?
Mm.
Like your typical open world MMORPG kind of quest to
Yeah.
just kind of ease your players into, because if it's familiar, it's going to be easy for them. You're going to put all those fun, complicated quests just outside that first entry level zone. So when I go into planning, I design a little bit of easy quests in the area. I'm going to design a few good town members. Usually I'm going to start with the tavern guy. Like, it's cliche, everybody starts in a tavern. If you're going to start in a tavern, the thing that's not cliche is having a well-defined like guy who owns the tavern, whether it be a barmaid or it's the brewmaster. You need somebody who's got some character. So I'm going to recommend always have a decent tavern person. Just maybe a mayor or some random hermit like wizard. You need to have some basic trope stuff in your starting HUD. Those are like the first things that I design when planning a new town.
So I'm a little bit different in this regard. So when I do sandboxes, I do a lot of work up front, because you kind of, with sandbox games, you pretty much have to build a lot of your stuff up front, even if it's just like your initial starting location and the general surrounding area. But I don't design everything up front. I very much kind of design stuff, or I see where the players are going, and I kind of build stuff as they go, and kind of place it in blocks like Legos. And one trick I found that actually is super useful for you GMs out there who don't have a lot of free time to sit there and homebrew quests and everything all day, is that whatever tabletop RPG you're playing, there's typically various one-shots or bounties or whatever available for either by the official sources. Like Paizo has their Pathfinder 2e one-shots. They have their full-on adventure paths. They have what they call as adventures, which is like their mini couple session adventures. And then they have bounties, which are basically like the hunts that Jackie describes. And then for like D&D, they have similar stuff. But then you have sources like Drive Through RPG, where third parties will go and publish their own adventures and one-shots and whatnot. So you have all these things accessible to you, and even from previous editions that are pretty easy to adapt to Pathfinder 2e or whatever edition you're playing. And I think that having a bunch of those and just kind of placing them around the world, probably with a little bit of massaging to make them fit whatever world you're working in, I think is probably the easiest approach to building out these quests and whatnot. If you're paying for them, it does cost a little bit of money up front, but you buy them once and you have them for any game you play in the future. They're like $2-3 each, so they're not like gonna break your bank like a full-on rule book would. But I think that's kind of the approach I take, and then I do homebrew my own stuff as well. If especially there's a website out there by a guy named Don John, which is not me, unfortunately, but he has a lot of random generators for tabletop RPGs, and one of the ones he has is a quest generator. And I'll sit there and I'll click through those and pick out a few here and there, and then just kind of place them in my world as like bounties or whatever. Usually things like go escort this person, or go kill this person, or go kill this creature, or whatever, and I'll kind of take them and fit them. And they're just quick little, like, especially in like a West Marches style game where, the goal is to have a session where you're in and out, right? You go in, you do your thing, you come back to the hub city, and the next time you might be with a completely different group of players, a completely different group of characters, whatever. So those kind of short, quick and easy things are really, really good, in my opinion. But if you're playing a more campaign style adventure, these are also good in there to act as fillers. And I think that if you have them, it's probably behooves you to kind of place them in a way that, if the players are probably going to go in this direction to head towards this city or this quest, maybe they have a bounty that's in that same general direction that they can kind of knock out on the way there,
There are things that make that a little bit easier, and there are things that make that harder.
Yeah.
Because, like, you just suggested, like, the players are going to go some direction. How do you know?
Well, I'm saying that you
some...
adapt it on the fly. So like during play, they're suggesting as a group, they're like, let's head head towards this town, and you're like, okay, well, they have bounties on the board, but the bounties on the board don't tell you anything about where these things are. So, they might go, well, before we head out, let's check the bounty board, see what's there. And you might say, okay, well, I know they're heading this direction, so I'm just going to say that this thing is somewhere down here, right? And kind of, I'm more of an adapt on the fly kind of person. I don't have strict, like, this is where this is, this is where this is, this is where this is. Always, I do that in some cases. And this is kind of like why in the West Marches game, when I don't have everything marked off on the, this is where this is where this is on the map up front. But once you discover it, I let you know where it was, because that way it leaves me enough flexibility to say, okay, well, I was planning to have this here, but they're kind of going off somewhere completely unexpected. So I'm just going to move this over here, kind of deal. And I did this with the orc camp that you guys discovered. It was in a completely different spot to begin with. But you guys were dealing with the Crete stuff, and I honestly didn't expect you to go all the way to the Crete nest. I thought you were going to deal with it a different way. But once you did, I'm like, well, how can I kind of make this work in their favor so that they can kind of get, because I really wanted to introduce the concept of factions, which we'll get to shortly. And I really wanted you guys to have that moral dilemma. It's like, okay, which side do I side with here? In order to do that, I had to introduce you to both factions. And you had already met the Crete, which are the ant folk in my world, but you hadn't yet met the orcs. And to kind of speed that meeting up, I kind of massaged the story I had planned, and then moved some things around to make it more easy for you guys to get there, and kind of nudge you and say, hey, I'm not telling you to go here, but you interface with these Cretes, and they want you to find some orcs, and there just happens to be some orcs over here if you want to go check it out. So I'm very much
that's exactly where we differ.
Yeah,
because we totally differ in that regards, because I don't do wandering monsters, and I actually do a lot less random stuff these days, and I try to let the random stuff, the improv, be the NPCs that you guys are going to interact with. So the encounters are very static, but what happens in the counters is where I try to increase the improv.
Yeah, I definitely have static encounters, but I do think that for things like moving between areas, like the exploration activities, I think that random encounters are an extremely important facet, because oftentimes players are moving large distances, and I don't know the exact route they're going to take. Like, because I think most GMs will probably run exploration theater of the mind. I don't think very many run them in map style like you do.
Nobody run them the way I run them.
So
it's either some people really hate it or some people really like it, or maybe you guys all hate it and you guys are all just telling me.
But so for me, it makes sense to do random encounters, and it also changes things up, right? Like, because when we head one direction, we might run into a pack of goblins, or maybe we won't run into anything, right? But when we head the other direction, what's there now? It's been like 3 weeks since we traveled this past, so something has changed. So I don't know what that is, and I think that making it random actually adds a bit of excitement and adds to the thing that we talked about players. The nice thing about Sandbox is that players can kind of use whatever tools and toys they have at their disposal to solve challenges, right? And if even me as the GM doesn't know what the challenge is going to be, then that just makes it even more exciting for everyone. That when they say, oh shit, we have a boulet, we're level 2, and we got a level 5 or 6, whatever boulet is, Pathfinder 2e creature that just popped out of the sands, right? What do we run? Do we have something at our disposal that we could take this down like unexpectedly? Like, what do we do here? And I think that adds a bit of tension to your game, and I don't know, a bit of fun in my opinion.
I'm gonna resort back to Colville, but I felt this way before I heard Colville's advice, but Colville said it much better, where he said you should always be one session ahead of your players.
Sure, so, but like Colville also heavily uses random monsters, so.
And do you miss the random encounters in any of my games? Since I don't do any random encounters.
I do, yeah. I love random encounters. But I think that when you're doing random encounters, you have to be. So I don't think that all random encounters should be combat encounters. And I don't think that all random encounters should be necessarily level appropriate. Like, there should, in your random encounter table, there should probably be things that are way higher level, and there should be things that are way lower level, and you know,
like Colville and the Red Dragon, because that just seems like that would be like a game breaker.
well, I mean, I like to think that if you put a red dragon in front of a party that's, uh, not particularly high level, then they're probably going to be smart enough to run or try to negotiate. I doubt very
Not
many
in my
players will
experience.
just straight up attack a red dragon willingly, like if they're not high level.
Do you remember? Do you remember our party when they encountered the Elder Shadow Dragon?
Yes.
What was the main attack plan?
Um, well, I think we
Charge
all went
straight
in.
in?
Well, so my main attack plan was to die because I wanted that campaign to end because we were taught this. For context, this was our last 5e game before we were getting ready to hop into Pathfinder 2e campaign, and I know at least some of us at that party were super excited to start playing Pathfinder 2e. So I don't think we were making the smartest decisions, but I don't think
No.
I think we were making the dumb decisions on purpose, if that makes sense. We also knew that it was like towards the end, the kind of the climatic fight, so we knew that something big was going to happen, and it was either negotiate and probably spend another session, or fight it and just end it now.
It's me thinking you would never challenge an Elder Shadow, where
Yeah.
like never in my mind did I think the players in the right mind.
What
would do
level
that,
were
but
we,
you guys
by the
were-
way? I don't even remember.
What level were you guys?
Yeah.
5?
No, we were higher. We were like 9 or 10, weren't we?
No, I don't think that a game of Minds of Fendelver goes like
That's
past
true.
level
Yeah.
3, and the fact that you guys were at level 5 was just a testament to how long that we were taking.
Yeah. I mean, admittedly, like I said, I was purposely not making good decisions. So I don't know if that's the greatest benchmark, but I don't know.
Let me give
let
you
us
another
know.
example.
Let us know in the comments.
My
Do you
party
think?
members? My party encountered a extremely powerful lich. Like, what do you think that their go-to plan was when they find a lich at the bottom of the dungeon?
Well, I would hope they don't try to. I mean, it depends on what level they are, but I'm assuming they're lower level, so I hope they don't try to engage it. They would at least try to negotiate, I would think, or
They
engage it.
absolutely did decide to free that lich and get on their good side and go completely evil. It just depends on your luck.
Yeah.
when
But I
you
mean,
have-
I also.
And those are scripted encounters. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I fear that if I were to put up a random encounter, that it could be a game changer or game breaker. Like, it would really ruin the flow of a game.
Well, to be clear, when I run sandbox games, I'm very upfront with my players to begin with that, hey, you're not going to be fighting, necessarily encountering things your level all the time. And I think that that's enough to kind of get players thinking that, hey, we're out here in the middle of the desert. We're not in a dungeon. We're not in a town. This is obviously not something that was planned, right? I think that, I don't know. I like to think that my players are smart enough to
We aren't.
figure that out. And in my experience, they have been. So I've definitely thrown many high level creatures at low level parties, and they've
We were
run.
ready to die in that orc encampment.
That was a winnable fight, though, admittedly.
We did win, so I
Yeah.
mean, clearly it was. But I mean, it could have gone. It could have gone the other way.
Yeah.
We don't know. So we differ with random monsters. So when you're planning how to make a sandbox, random monster tables are going to be your friend. John has quite a few suggestions for finding good random encounters. I actually don't do that method. Instead, like with your hex crawl, I'm usually going to pre-plan like what I think should be in that area. I might leave some leeway to chance. I might say there are 1 to 3 of these, 1 to 3 of this, etc. But it's usually very, very
Yeah.
strict. So those are the different things when looking at planning.
I will say, when I do random tables, I do tailor what's in those tables to the environment. Like, you're not going to find a panther in the middle of the desert, right? Or you're not going to find, like, I don't know, spiders in I can't even think of an example off the top of my head, but you know what I mean, right? You're not. It's very theme tailored to where if you're in a desert, you're going to be fighting things that you would expect to find in a desert, right?
You're not going to find an octopus in a desert.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, see, John, what you should be doing is you should totally throw octopuses in your desert, because now you're gonna think outside the mold, and you're gonna come up with a desert, based octopus,
is
and you're gonna have
a
to
desert
respin the whole
octopus
thing,
just a
right?
hydra?
Sure, you could have a desert hydra. Maybe it pulls the boats in the desert.
Or a manticore?
Right, so a whale in a jungle totally makes sense, right? It just rolls through the forest and it just takes out all the trees, and then new growth can appear.
Maybe it's
there,
a sky
right?
whale. Maybe it's one of those whales that go through
I
the
was
sky.
thinking like a Snorlax. Like you need to find it's blocking the path, and you need to find some kind of ocarina of time to kind of awaken it.
Yeah, I mean, be smart with
Razzo,
your encounters, and like I said, all random encounters don't need to be combat. Maybe most of the time, actually, they probably aren't combat. They're probably like you encounter a trader or something that lets the players like stock up on items or something.
Mm-hmm.
Or
yeah, that's a good idea.
Or you could have a chance that they might encounter a quest. Maybe they encounter a trader who is being attacked by bandits, and you either deal with the bandits or you ignore them and move on your way, or
help the bandits.
Like, yeah, I mean, it's totally up to you what you want to do there. And depending on the outcome of that quest, you might spawn a whole other quest line, right? So there's all kinds of things you could do there. And maybe if you want them to hit that quest, you will kind of, make it a pre-planned thing. I mean, maybe you don't use a wandering encounter for that. Maybe you just say, they're going to go in this direction. I want them to encounter this thing, so they're going to encounter it. Like, wandering tables are just a tool, right? Like, you don't need to use them all the time. They're just something you should have in your back pocket to kind of add filler to the game.
Right. You should always be one session ahead. Got to
Right.
plan that stuff in advance.
Yeah. I do find that with Sandbox games, it's difficult to impossible to really plan one session ahead, though. For the full-on Sandbox
plan
game.
each cardinal directions, and I plan something in every direction based on where you guys go. So when you guys were in Viserys, if you went south of Viserys, I knew what was there. If you guys went east, I had a general idea of what would be there. If you went west, I had a general idea.
I don't have time. I don't have time to prep all that in advance. I don't have
Absolutely,
time.
I planned all that in advance. So each week you kind of plan like these things, and before you know it, the party will stay in one spot long enough where you'll catch up, and you'll have extra weeks where you'll have time to kind of plan on additional areas. And then as you get used to that, you get into a groove of it. There'll be weeks where you don't have to do any planning at all.
Yeah.
I overplanned Viserys so much so that it got to the point where I didn't work on Viserys at all, and I ended up working on a separate campaign entirely. And I was working on Libra for several months in a row because of just how much content I had made for one area.
I am much more of the illusion of choice style of gameplay, in that you have a choice of where you want to go, but you're going to encounter what I have designed no matter what you do, kind of deal.
So the tower looks to be to the east, right? Let's go west. And then, we found the tower. We must have gone lost.
that obvious. It'll be much more sleight of hand.
Somebody
I will have a few
fail
different
that
things
survival
planned.
check.
But I guess what I'm getting at is that there are ways you can be more efficient with your planning that don't necessarily need to plan everything up front. Just two different styles of game design, right? I think that my approach is much more old school, I guess, in that like a lot of things were much more left to chance in like early games of D&D. The games of back then, there were various assumptions about D&D games that don't necessarily hold today. Like the idea of like an epic fantasy game just wasn't really a thing back then. It was much more of a dungeon crawl style of game, or if you were gonna do sandboxing, it was more of a mega dungeon approach. So it is what it is. There's different ways of looking at it. I think either one's viable. It just depends on how much time you have as a person, right? If you have the time to design everything up front, that's awesome. Like, definitely do it, because you can really make.
We have very different styles of designing things.
Yeah.
You use really beautiful pre-gen maps. Your tile set is gorgeous. There's no confusion about what the things are,
Mm-hmm.
and I hand draw everything.
Yeah.
So we have very different styles of doing things. So that's why we're giving advice for like the devil and the angel on the shoulder.
Right.
John's the angel.
Well,
Listen to his advice
far.
if you want the easy stuff. If you're like some of the other GMs, like I've coached Razzo and Tramer, who we interviewed, and I think they're in the same camp of I must be prepared for everything. I'm gonna be prepared for everything.
I definitely started that way, and then as I gained experience as a GM, I started to realize that it really didn't matter that much, and I became
once you
much
get a good crew,
lax.
it does not matter because they're going to show up to. Was it Koval who talked about this, or was it WebDM who talked about it's
Koval.
Game night and they show up to play? Yeah. It doesn't really matter what you guys play because you guys are just friends now and you're just showing up to play.
And yeah, it was Koval, I think. But that's also something I should bring up too. Is if I do encounter a situation where something is there and I just really didn't plan for it, and I don't have any way, I can't think of a way to adapt anything to fit where I'm going. Like they're going this direction, which I didn't even conceive. I don't have anything planned for that. I'll be upfront with my players. I'll be like, hey, you can go that way, and we can break, and I can plan for it. And we can come back next week because I don't have any of this planned. But if you want to kind of switch gears and go somewhere else, we can keep playing, kind of deal. I have no shame in that. I think that if you're playing with, good people, they'll understand that, that's just something that happens sometimes. I try not to let it happen. If there's really somewhere that I didn't plan for, then I'll do what I suggested before, and I'll kind of take something else
Absolutely.
I had adapted on the fly.
And you're talking about that key information with when you're doing a linear adventure, when you're doing a module, you can almost do no communication with your players whatsoever. You can totally hide behind your screen and be an evil GM, and people will probably applaud you for it. But when you're doing a sandbox, a lot of communication needs to happen. And I've done that with you guys. I'm sure you guys have noticed where we talked about, did we want to go do that raid, the first raid back in the shaft over in Hedron? You guys communicated that you felt you guys had enough party members and you wanted to assault the raid. So I bust my butt to get that raid completed and ready for you guys and to deliver something that was kind of extraordinary.
Yeah.
There's another raid nearby, and the party is like, we don't think we're ready for that yet. And you guys have expressed that you're not interested. So I've kind of slowly just been putting some broader paint strokes over time. So like right now, like the state of it, I've got the layout, done in Roll20. I've done the maps. I have some basic monsters, but it's not really completed. It's kind of rough sketches. And that really helps for developing these areas so that way, if the players do come in there, I can slap on a fresh coat of paint and it's ready to go. So I talked about this before. I don't remember what video we were talking about, where we kind of, because you like to design them to a T, you do all of the designs, and I kind of do rough sketches and kind of fill it in.
I do want to clarify that I only go to that level of detailed design in like dungeons, right? Where there's a lot of props, there's a lot of things that people can hide behind, etc. I do not do that for like overland travel. Like, when you guys experience stuff in overland travel, it's typically just like a brown color on the background and like maybe some random props placed down, right? Like it's very much context sensitive for me. So
a bit more theory of the mind. So I mean that also helps. You're a bit more descriptive, where I'm more relying on the players interacting with the NPCs. That's kind of my go-to, because I'm a writer, and so like the most important thing to me when I look at a book is where are the quotes, who's doing the talking, because exposition can kind of be boring, and that's just my personal opinion.
Yeah, I agree.
It's you can roast me. I thought Lord of the Rings was terribly boring because it was all exposition and there was very little talking. And when they got to the talking, it was extremely interesting. But I didn't want to hear the shape and the rocks and the colors of the trees. Like,
oh, you mean the books, Lord of the Rings? Gotcha. Okay.
Right.
I don't know. I feel like in fantasy novels that kind of I don't want to call that exposition. I would call that description. And I think painting a scene like that is actually something that me personally, I mean, it's not for everyone obviously, but me personally, I enjoy that level of detail in stories because it really lets me picture a vivid picture of what's going on. It can be overdone. I think that if you go too far with it, it can be like, okay. Like I get it. There's, the rocks are gray. Okay, let's move on. And I've definitely been there too.
There's a sliding scale between I want to know what the scene is, painting the scene, right, and then oh my god, this is exposition at this point.
Yeah.
And I feel like I have very rarely seen DMs do this where they're talking too much. and they're
Yeah.
describing too much of the land. I'd say if anything, we're not describing it enough. If anybody in the chat has felt like the GM just talked on and on, I'm curious to see that. I don't see that very often these days.
I do think description is a little less important these days when you're playing on virtual games, because you typically have some kind of map or something that at least to some degree represents what the actual place looks like. Whereas like when you're playing in person, right, you might still have a map, but it's usually very crudely drawn, like with like a Sharpie, just like a few circles here and there or whatever. And I feel like that descriptive text becomes a lot more important, which, you know, as the things go back to normal and we get back into playing in-person games again, it might become important again. But I think for virtual games, you do need some. I agree, but I think that it's a little less important. But something you mentioned, Jack, and I wanted to kind of tangent along, is that you mentioned that you put a lot of stock into NPC interactions with your players.
Yes.
Do you use factions in your game?
There are quite a bit of factions in just about every game I do, and I was kind of designing them as factions without realizing it. To take Tagasia, for example, there are 4 courts to the Fae, and there are 2. What's up, P. Razzo?
It's
Cobalt.
hey,
I get you.
20 Cobalt.
I see what you did there. This Cobalt is a blue steel or
I see the text
mineral.
above it. Is it a shale or a slate? Okay, I didn't see that.
That is punny beyond all belief. You totally derailed me. What were we talking about? I got derailed.
Factions. Factions.
Factions, right. So between the different courts, and then there are the lizard folk and the
Cat folk.
And the cat folk who are kind of fighting. And the party has encountered a lot of different factions as they've been going through. So there's like individual towns. I feel like a town should have its own kind of like faction meter. And I started using the faction meter to kind of help boost along the growth of a town. I stopped making my towns very static, since for this particular game, the party is really into building up the towns. A lot of players are heavy interested in crafting. If you're playing at a table, you're probably gonna find at least one player that's interested in crafting, but I think most of us are pretty interested in the crafting section. So building up the town, edifying it is a huge deal. So each individual town has its own kind of faction points within it. And then we also have the Thieves Guild, and there's a schism in the Thieves Guild, right? So like there are, when you further the Thieves Guild, I have to kind of decide, are we furthering all parts of the Thieves Guild, or is this only affecting one part of the schism within the Thieves Guild?
So the reason I bring that up is because to me, factions are critical in any sandbox game. And because they allow players to align themselves with NPCs, and they present opportunities for you as the GM to create inciting encounters that come more naturally than anything you have like pre-planned from the get-go, right? Like if somebody allies themselves with the Thieves Guild, now you have the opportunity to add a bunch of new quests that are specific to the Thieves Guild, and then you also have the potential for faction conflict, which can add its own layer story. So in sandboxes, I think that you have these you might have a main plot line, but you have these various quest lines, and then if you can find a way to merge those quest lines together into and make them cross even, then that adds a bit of excitement to your games. And I actually have faction rules coming. I'm actually working on them right now for creating factions as characters. And this is an idea I took from Fate, where each faction has a level and it has skills that may or may not equate to player skills. Like you have some that are the same skills that players might have. You have some that are unique to factions. And I haven't decided if I want to use ability score, make those ability score based or not. I might. We'll see.
Checks would make it interesting.
Yeah. So if you have faction conflict, you can actually roll out literally roll the combat of those factions. You can literally have you might give the faction to the players and let them play it, and then you fight against another faction, right? And you have if you have a resources skill, perhaps where you want to utilize your resources to overpower the other faction, and your factions have quote unquote HP, which once the faction's HP reaches 0, then the faction is destroyed. It no longer exists. So you can have these kind of complex faction wars, and streamline them down to a series of skill checks, basically, which I think is kind of cool. It's something that works really well in Fate, and I think that it would work really well in Pathfinder. I mean, obviously, I got to play test this, and which is one of the reasons I have various factions and Shifting Sands, is that it's going to be a sort of a test bed for this idea. I will be publishing these rules on the website even before I play test them, so you can kind of get your opinions on them and update or revise them over time.
So back to like Sandbox and factions and why they're so important. When you're playing a linear game, it kind of plays out like Alice in Wonderland. You go to here, you go to here, you go to here, and usually there's very little backtracking. And so factions are a huge filler. They can. This is how I ended up having a surplus of time on my hands, is because my game was not linear. It wasn't about me going. You guys weren't going from quest and come back, go to the quest, come back, or going on a straight path. You guys didn't notice just how much your quests had factions, and so it can be something as little as when you complete the quest, like who do you turn it into, or how do you complete the quest at the end? Do you kill them or do you turn them? Do you sacrifice it or do you return it back to somebody? Does it belong in an archaeological site? Do you leave it where you found it? Those quest endings. When you give the players that kind of option, you let them know that it's an option and that these are the decisions that are going to affect your factions. You can turn a simple quest, which will divert the players into some sort of faction, and kind of it could be the next set of quests for them, because they're like, well, I want to do this, and it might affect a particular court. In this example, when you guys were dealing with Sam Weldon versus Bastardam, you guys were meandering between the summer and the spring courts, and you guys didn't even realize that you guys were kind of aligned with that method, and so that caused the as you build up the frost and this as you built up the spring and the summer courts, the winter courts kind of got jealous, and that's why you guys had that kind of backlash. And so you can use those factions to help flush out your game. It's going to give incentive for your players to visit areas again, and if you need them, you don't have time. Life happens. You don't have time to prepare stuff. Your players, and you guys, I'm sure you guys noticed, you guys were in town dealing with Fey Lords and their tricks and all of their lies, even though they tell the truth. It was keeping you guys in town forever.
Yeah, I mean, I think that factions, like you said, they also give a way to branch the quest tree a bit, right? So you might go down this road, you might go down this road. It might lead back to the same place. It might lead somewhere different, but it kind of lets each. So if you're running the sandbox multiple times, it lets each experience feel different, right? And I think that's important. I would actually go out to say that sandbox games are a great game to run multiple systems in. So for instance, you might be primarily playing in Pathfinder 2e, but maybe you do a quest with the Thieves Guild, right? Well, I mean, there happens to be a tabletop RPG who's literally designed around being a member of some kind of thieves or assassins guild or something, called Blades in the Dark, that is designed around that kind of style of play. Maybe for a couple sessions, you just do a quick Blades in the Dark one shot and then go back to Pathfinder, right? You just port your characters over and do that. I mean, it's something that I haven't really personally tried, but I think it makes sense. Like, yes, if you have you're in a vampire heavy place, maybe you switch over to Vampire the Masquerade, or maybe if you're in a very cinematic story kind of driven narrative style of play, you might consider switching over to Fate Core. I think that the nice thing about Sandbox is that it's so open, right, and so flexible that you can kind of do whatever and make it work. And I think that it might give you a chance to play with other systems and kind of broaden your horizons, expand your palette a bit. It's something, like I said, it's something I haven't tried personally, but it's something I've been wanting to try because I think it's a neat idea.
That is a really good idea. I really like that.
So,
Now I wanna sneak that into my. I'm gonna steal that idea. Good GM steal.
Yeah, I mean, we do have
Here,
a Thieves Guild quest line in your Tagasia game, so and you have been
we
when you
have
run a Blades in the Dark game, so
right. I'm really tempted to let you guys get a taste of the courts. Um, I had wanted to do more courtly stuff,
Mhm.
and I don't remember how we came on to the idea of running Tagasia. Uh, because I had run all these ideas with a different group beforehand, and so I had prepared for the courts. And Tagasia was kind of like a way for me to flesh out the courts.
Mhm.
So I think I'm ready to kind of run one that is going to be more Fey focused. It would probably be with a different group because you guys are probably fade out at this point. You guys
Yeah.
are faded.
That was a good one. So we are coming up on an hour. Did you want to keep going with this, or do you have more to add there? Or?
I could talk about sandboxes for eternity. So one of the things I want to talk about running a sandbox, if you're still game for it,
Sure.
is the power creep.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about the initial setup of a sandbox. Some of these games are going to go on, and if you get a good crew, I have a great crew. My people, you guys are amazing. I know you guys. Some of you guys are watching this now. Some of you guys are watching this later. You guys are amazing because you guys show up every week. To those who show up every week, and
Hold on, I just noticed
because
Pat
of that,
Pirazzo's. I just noticed Pirazzo's comment. He said, "These sound like John plugs. Who's paying you, John? No one's paying me. I just really like to experiment with new tabletop RPGs. We are not sponsored,
I
so
someone getting paid to advertise all of the RPGs.
I wish
you know
that
what I
was.
mean?
I wish that was my job. I could shill
That
any
is
game you
our
throw
job.
at me.
It is our job to promote all of the different tabletop RPGs. And right now the big ones are D&D and Pathfinder, which is why we talk about those the most. And if it were to change, like, you know, if John and I went to Japan, we'd probably be talking about Call of Cthulhu more than anything else, because that's like the majority of what they play over there. But so some more complex GM game mastery stuff would be managing those games. They go on for a long time. And what level are you guys? You guys are 11 now?
11. We just hit 11. Yeah. Actually,
and
we just hit 11.
I am balancing. Each player has NPCs, followers. Each player is at this point. I think you guys are all running 2 players, two individual characters.
I have like 3 or 4 characters, but only 2 of them are playing at a any given time. Yeah.
Right, and we're constantly upping the ante because I'm giving out homebrewed gear and equipment rewards, which John, we need to cover rewards.
We have it on our list, actually. I think already.
We're gonna add that to the list. So balancing the game becomes an issue. If you're playing 5th edition and your sandbox gets to level 10, I suggest you cap it off. If you're playing Pathfinder, or if you're playing 4th edition, you can run it all the way to level 20, and you shouldn't have any problems. If you're running homebrew content, you're going to notice problems at a sooner level. So you got to be prepared for your players to come up with some really wild stuff to kind of solve the problems. And I think that's where a lot of the GM frustration comes from, is that you just spend a bunch of time designing something and then your players, steamroll it.
Yeah.
So,
but managing... I think a lot of people are scared of that happening. I don't think it's that big of a deal. Because I think that it's perfectly reasonable to kind of let that happen and then adapt on the fly if it does happen. I don't think so. If you have like a BBEG planned and your characters just steamroll it, there's various things you can do, right? Like you can make them run away early, right? And then they come back stronger next time. You can
I've never done that before.
You can I mean, if you're playing in person, you might consider, I know this is a controversial topic, but you might consider fudging HP or rolls. If you wanted to just kind of make it a little more climatic. There's various tools at your disposal you can do there. Maybe you can decide on the fly that, oh, maybe this wasn't the BBEG. Maybe this was who you thought the BBEG was, but he was really just a general or something, right? And then someone bigger and badder comes out of the woodwork. So there's a lot of things you can do there. I wouldn't be so scared of that happening.
Let it happen. That, like what you said, letting it happen is like one of the best things to do, because instead of being so worried about the players winning, you got to think about what do you get, like how are they going to live with that victory if they decimate the BEG? Like maybe they're the bad guys, maybe what they did has cost a toll on the rest of society. When you're dealing with those really heavy stakes with the BBG, and it's the fate of the world is at hands. Some BBGs are like that, not all of them, but maybe they it's time to wrap up the story when they defeat that, and that's okay. You can put your players back in that same spot exactly where they left off and let them do the side quests that they want to do, the end game content.
Especially in a sandbox where you're not confined to the typical flow of a story, right? Necessarily. Like you're more, it's more discrete plot lines than it is like overarching campaigns. So you don't necessarily need your ending to be ultra climatic, right? You don't necessarily need that. Maybe it just ends up being a pushover and your players were just over level for it. Who cares? I think my general philosophy and mantra and just tabletops RPGs in general is that I'm not concerned with either side winning or losing. I'm more concerned with looking cool doing
it. Hell yeah, they're really cool. I want to point out that video games, what is the norm, John? Is the norm that you get to that last boss and you barely have enough stamina and moxie to defeat them? Or did you do all the side quests? You have the ultimate weapons, and
I don't know if
that
there's a
final boss?
norm,
Because
and I
the
think it
boss that
heavily
you beat
depends on the
to get that
game.
ultimate weapon, wasn't that boss harder than the final boss?
Yes, if you didn't plan for it, right? If you didn't sit there and grind for hours and before you approach the boss, like if you're talking about Final Fantasy VII's ultimate weapon, right? Is that what you're alluding to?
Like a 10, honestly. Really, in my mind I was thinking going through and going into the Omega dungeon and beating those bosses, and then going to Sin and finishing off the
Right,
main
so like
quest there.
technically in those situations, those bosses, so to speak, are designed around the idea that after you beat the game, you're going to spend hours upon hours grinding before you even take on that boss, right? But then there's other games where the BBEG, like the final boss in a game like The Last of Us, which is more linear, right? It's generally designed around whatever the player is supposed to be level wise. If it's a level based game, Last of Us really isn't. But if it's whatever level, whatever skill or power level that the player character is going to be or expected to be around that time, the boss is designed around that. So it depends on the type of game, what you're going for, the feel you're going for, etc. I wouldn't say there's one style that's more common over the others necessarily. The linear of us. I mean, it really is. I mean, I hate to say it, but and that's
right.
That's fine. I mean,
And
it's that kind of game, right? People are looking for, if they're playing that game, they're looking for that.
A sandbox doesn't need to have a BBEG. It can have multiples of different factions, and it can be up to you to decide what faction you're going to be. And if you like the randomness, plan out who your big bad bosses are going to be of each faction, and leave it to the players to pick a faction and decide who they're going to take out. Maybe they're going to take the first one they take out is going to be level appropriate, and the last one they take out's not.
Yeah.
You can totally, and you don't even need to wrap up a sandbox. You really don't. If you think about Skyrim, I've never actually beaten the final. What is that last dragon? Never actually fought him.
Akatosh or whatever.
Too busy doing the Mage Guild's quest because it's too much fun. And
well, Skyrim actually has the Radiant Quest system, which basically infinitely generates quests for you, so you never really run out of them. They're not going to be the most deep quests in the world, but you'll have something to do forever, basically.
They stole my kid from my house. I got really upset and I had to go kill some bandits. Okay. After that happened, I was like, I never feel safe again.
So, I mean, the nice thing about factions too is that just like a settlement, they should grow, right? Like, so if you do take out a competing faction like completely, then the other competing faction is probably gonna gain some steam and it's gonna start to grow. until another faction comes out of the woodwork and steal some of the
Nature abhors a
resources. So
vacuum,
yeah,
right? Are you familiar with the nature abhors a vacuum? You take out a faction, and this is something that we should add to your rules, John. Is that when another faction dies, the faction that does the killing blow gets a horde of rewards, right?
mm-hmm.
But there should be a little phoenix egg somewhere that kind of says, who is going to take over all of that turf? Maybe
Right.
something kind of fills in, a little bit of the other sides, the boundaries kind of expand out a bit, and maybe there's a newcomer.
Yeah.
This gives rise for some of the other factions that you've neglected to build up in power or level up on
Yep.
the side.
Exactly.
Especially if they're opposing you, or because your faction is growing so much, now they're going to see you as a threat.
Yeah.
They could become hostile towards you.
Yeah, so there's definitely, and that's the perfect time to throw another, I don't hate to use the word ultimatum, but another choice in front of your players. It's like, you took out this faction, this other faction's growing big and evil. Then you have this little guy who's underdog coming up. Do you want to side with them, or do you want to take out the little guy and side with the bigger guys? Like it's a choice, right? Like, and
absolutely,
I think choices are what makes Sandbox run.
We got to work on some more Sandbox stuff that is going to be non-combat focused for dealing with those things. I know, like the party went to a gala. This was a while back. I don't know if you were there for that game. Did you go to that?
I don't think I was there for the gala.
Had to kind of craft proper gear to get into, or buy the proper clothing to get into this
I think
gala.
I was there for the preparations, but I think the gala happened shortly after I took a break for work.
Right.
So
for non-combat oriented stuff, for putting in your sandboxes, getting on with with your different factions, there should be things that you can do within your own faction, and that should be brown nosing and kissing ass, and kind of getting more information out of the players. I kind of stole that from, I think it was the Dark Brotherhood in Oblivion, where you could get to know some of the people in the Dark Brotherhood, and they all had their own little like individual stuff that they needed to work on. And that really kind of threw me for a loop, because I was like, wow, within the main quest line, there's other people here who have additional stuff. So you kind of help, flesh it out.
Pirazzo, yeah, you're right. I was there for that. That was very early, actually. That was really early in the campaign.
John entered the kitchen looking for a guy who wasn't there. Oh, is that the
Saren
shady guy?
The Saren was eating.
Are you guys talking about shady guy? Who is that?
No, shady guy was something different. But
yeah, those guys. So we talked a little bit about balancing, managing some of the later game content. You've just got to let your players win, and you got to be okay with your BBs dying. It's totally okay. And you also have to be okay with your players not being interested in the BBG, and just kind of let him do his own thing somewhere else.
Yeah.
Just with quest hooks, it starts off with not bombarding your players, right, with the options. Some of those quests should be resolved. I noticed with a previous game where the players didn't want to do any of the particular hooks at the time. They were interested in one particular thing. I just resolved them on the side and said, an adventurer squad went and did this, and they completed it. Because some of that little stuff is going to get taken care of. Look at like Goblin Slayer. While everyone is off killing the Demon Lord, there's going to be a bunch of low-level people who are going to be kind of taking care of those other quests.
That's actually a good point too, and adding time-sensitive quests can also add a bit of verisimilitude as well. Like you might have quests that are available, but if you don't tackle them immediately, someone else might take care of them ahead of you. If there's other adventures in your world, you have to be careful there.
Should be.
Well, yes, there should be, but you have to be careful not to let the other adventures outshine the players, because this is the game. The players are the heroes, right? So you don't want them to feel like bested all the time. You don't want them to feel like there's another group who are better.
That depends. I started making the world feel more realistic by adding more and more adventures to the group, and it was because the party members were looking for recruits. I was doing a sandbox with two major guys who were constantly in the game, and then we would have some of our friends who could only commit like one session a month kind of thing. So there's my 2 designated people, and they needed to kind of fill in the roster. So having extra adventurers worked in that situation for us. Nowadays with tabletop RPGs, being able to find 7 players in our current Togasia game, we don't have that same problem.
I guess my point here is not player run adventures. My point is that if you have NPC adventures in your game, they shouldn't be outshining the players because it makes the players feel unsatisfied. But there should be, they can be shunned sometimes. I'm not saying you should never shun.
Listen to John's advice. John is 100% right. I just like to take, the things you're not supposed to do, and I do them anyways.
No, I mean, you're right. You should
those adventures against each other, John, yeah. And it ended up being pretty glorious because the party knew some of these people from different adventures. They had one person with them, but then they disagreed and parted ways. And so when they ended up seeing the opposing adventurers, they were hired to kill them.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there should be other adventurers in the world, and they should be opposing factions and whatnot. But I'm saying that you have to be careful not to do it too much, because if you do it too much, if you constantly make the players bested by these NPCs adventurers, the players no longer will feel like heroes, and that's kind of an unsatisfying thing. But you do really, it's kind of a balancing act, right? You still want the realism that there's other people in this world too. Mm-hmm. So you need to kind of balance that scale so that
the things to do, like for John's suggestion, since he is in the 99% percentile about this, and there's that 1% that I'm referring to, one of the things that you can do is have the to scale up the level for appropriate. You had that level 1 mine. Nobody went to go solve the problem in the mine because the party went off and did something, and you kind of want to just close it off. Well, you can do some things to up that ante by saying, you know what, there was something bigger or badder in there. Maybe the problem was ignored for so long that, I don't know, Power Rangers make my monster grow, and adventure party went in there and they got totally goblin slayered.
Yeah.
And they need help. That is going to give a chance for your players to shine, be heroes, show up and save the day, and it's going to give them a little more incentive to go to an area that you spent a lot of hours designing. You can kind of sweeten the pot, and because we're giving advice fluctuating between giving advice to players and giving advice to GMs. Yeah. GMs make content; they want their players to play it.
Yeah, just because you make a level 1 mine doesn't mean it needs to stay level 1 forever, right?
Exactly, and that's what I had to do with like the Halite Mines was a level 2 area, and when you guys went in there, I started off by making that level 2 area. I just did hard mode, and I made it all of the enemies kind of use their action economy to your guys' advantage, and you guys were completely thwarted, and they were just like level 2 creatures.
Yeah. So,
or you can go about the other way and scale them up. There's a lot of ways to scale up creatures. I feel like we should probably cover that, John, in a future thing about taking crit ratings or enemy levels and scaling them down or scaling them up to kind of show examples of like what to cut and what to add in.
Yeah, maybe. We can add to our list. I think that the Game Master Guide has pretty good rules on doing that. Yeah, we could do a video on talking about how that works.
Well, I think you and I have very different approaches to that, so we could probably either share ideas alone.
Yeah.
Because you always have some interesting ideas, the things I never thought of.
Yeah, I mean, we could do a video on that. It wouldn't be bad. We could add to the list. We've got quite the list growing at this point, so I'm happy to add more.
We're never gonna run out of ideas.
I know. That's what I like. That's what I like.
Was there anything else that you wanted to cover under Sandboxes?
No, I don't think so. I think I've covered most of the topics I wanted to hit on. Was there anything you wanted to add on?
I'm trying to think. So we covered short term, long term.
Preparation.
We need to come up with some more non combat encounter stuff. So we'll add that to the list maybe.
Yeah. We need to do West Marches, like not postmortem, but like.
Well,
West
why don't we
Marches
talk about the West Marches real quick, because that's.
Well, I kind of want to do another stream on that, because that I could go into. I've learned a lot of things running a West Marches game, because this is my first one I've run. So I kind of want to dedicate an entire stream to that, and I kind of want your feedback, get your opinion as a player as well in that West Marches campaign. Because like I said, this is my first one. I've never run anything like this before, and it's kind of a learning experience. And I've screwed a lot of shit up, and I've pardon my French, and you know, I've learned a lot of stuff along the way. So I think that, you know, the things you found unsatisfactory will be useful for people to hear, and things I've learned as a GM will be useful to people here as well. So I think doing an entire stream on West March's postmortem ish is something we should do. Maybe not next time, but you know, at some point in the future.
Well, we'll add that to the list. That's awesome. All right, so I guess it's time to wrap up then.
Yep.
Okay.
This will be on. I mean, it's gonna be on YouTube pretty much immediately because it is streamed on YouTube. It'll be on Odyssey and Spotify. Well, the audio version will be on Spotify shortly, within the next couple days, depending on how much free time I get to edit it up and you know, upload it and whatnot. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I will have some. Well, for one, I'm gonna finally finish editing the companion rules, so that'll be done this week, and then I'm gonna start jotting down the actual copy for the faction rules, and then get those out for review by Jack and get some, you know, editing done on that. Jack, did you have any homebrew stuff you were planning to post anytime soon?
So I finished Bree in the last week that we spoke. So that game will be underway soon, I hope. But the holiday season is hit, so everyone's availability has changed. So I'll be pumping out some homebrew content shortly. I got to get in touch with my artist. We've got 3 new ideas that I want to kind of pump out for the Wild Hunts. Since the Wild Hunts, I think people kind of liked. Were you going to enter in the monster creation?
I wasn't. I was going to see if you were going to enter the Try to say one.
I want to, but I can't follow directions.
Oh, okay. I can look into that for you. I don't know if it's over now, but I'll look into it. Let me write a
Either
note to
way,
do that real quick.
so now that Bree's done, we're finishing up Aranax. So we have one more week of Call of Cthulhu. So I might be introducing some alternate rules for Call of Cthulhu, since I essentially did Sandbox Call of Cthulhu, and the game hasn't ended yet, so I'll be getting feedback from the players, and we'll kind of add that into the synopsis there for how to run other tabletops in that kind of sandbox style, even when it's not, obviously, what'd you say, inherent to the rules. Most people were kind of like scratching their head who had played Call of Cthulhu beforehand, and I said this is going to be a sandbox style Call of Cthulhu.
Speaking of Call of Cthulhu and Fate and whatnot, we are going to be starting up another mini series. It'll be more sporadic. It won't be like every week like this one. But as we try out and play different tabletop RPGs, we'll be doing a video, pre-recorded, not necessarily a stream, but a pre-recorded video on our thoughts on it, what we liked about it, what we didn't like about it, things we weren't sure about maybe, and try to get perspective from the players and the game masters on each of them. So kind of like a mini review, I guess you could say, of each of the games we try. So far, we still need to finish the Fate game, for one. I think after the holidays, once things calm down, we'll probably swing back into that. I think there's probably 2 sessions remaining there.
Right.
So
it's just giving you more time to prep for it.
I've actually got everything prepped. I could, other than making a couple NPCs and Foundry, I'm actually ready to finish that game. So it's more like when everyone gets time after the holidays and we can get together again. So
that, and you've been pretty busy with doing Shifting Sand since we started. We've got 2 groups going now.
I guess 2 groups. The players in that group are kind of mixed, and then the characters are separate. So like Jack, for instance, is in both groups, but they're playing 2 different characters, so that's kind of cool. That's how I wanted to kind of envision the game going to begin with. So it's finally fun to see that actually work in practice. We're always looking for new members, so there is a Discord link, which is in the video description, I believe, already. Check that out. There's also a separate Discord link for the Art of Game Mastery Discord. That's just the general channel Discord. You can hop in. There's a lot of banter going on in there. We have a a stream of Paizo news. So if you're interested, or no, that's in the Shifting Sands Discord. In the Shifting Sands Discord, we have a stream of Paizo news. Every time Paizo posts anything on their blog, it gets forwarded to our Discords. You can see that there. And yeah, so come join us there. We also have a Reddit, we have Twitter, we have Mastodon. As we mentioned before, we have Odyssey, YouTube.
Thank you for everybody who commented on the Reddit, since we talked a little bit about sandboxes. So all of you guys who commented, thank you so much for having like such a wild discussion.
Yeah, I'd love to see engagement on our posts and our communities. It really helps us figure out what you guys like, what you don't like, what you want to see more of, what you don't, etc.
Posting more polls on Twitter. So if you guys are looking for the polls where you guys can give us the feedback, Twitter seems to be the best tool for us for making easy polls. So we will be using that. Yeah. So if you guys do, we'll of course link it in the Discords. So we'll be probably working on another poll to kind of get feedback from you guys. So don't forget to check the Twitter polls. If you don't have Twitter, of course, you guys can always, if you're on Discord, hit us up, let us know.
Yep.
Because we appreciate you guys' feedback. Thank you guys.
We have we have been trying to use Instagram more. So I recently put a short on Instagram. We're going to try to start doing more of that. So follow us there if you don't already. I think that's it on my end. Jack, did you have any last second?
Last thing I want to say is I would really like to GM in Shifting Sands, so let's get some more players in there.
Yes, let's do it. If we can get more players in there, we can get more GMs, and I can actually play in my world instead of GM
it. we got like 5 new players in the last couple of weeks. So yeah. I know you guys are out there looking for a fun game to engage with.
It is Pathfinder 2E.
If you guys are just new to the area, come check us out. We like to banter with you guys all day and all night. I noticed that the banter is getting really good because there's starting to be like a bunch of us.
Yeah.
I just want to do some shout outs to some of you guys who came up with some really awesome ideas for characters between, we had 2 new monks, and I have not actually played with any monks yet.
Yeah, it was fun to see
my first time getting to see that. So.
And we have 2 very different monks, by the way. We have one, not even just like ancestry, but like also the type of monk they are, right? We have one that's very much like a hit hard and fast, and we have one that's more of like a agile, multiple attack, flurry of blows style monk. So it's kind of neat to see the 2 different types of styles in play. So yeah, if you want to join us there, come on over. We'd love to have you.
Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah. Till next time. Happy gaming.